back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and as we continue our discussion of this situation in Afghanistan, of course, I am, as always, looking forward to speaking with my next guest. He's been on the show a number of times. We always appreciate him and enjoy having him on, even when the subject matter is grim. Danny Sjursen, that's Sjursen, for those of you listening on the radio. Danny Sjursen is a retired U.S. Army major, taught history and is at West Point and is a military strategist by training as well. He is now the director of the Eisenhower Media Network, or EMN, that provides what I would call rational ex-military folks to the media. And he is the author of a number of books, the latest of which, if I get it exactly right, if I don't get it exactly right, correct me, A True History of the United States. Was that right, Danny?
That's right. Okay. Don't try the subtitle, though, because even I can't remember the whole thing.
Yeah, no, I don't do subtitles. I have to get paid time and a half for subtitles. So without any further ado, Danny Sjursen, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thank you. Always glad to talk about this. And if there's a vital topic that comes up, I'm always happy on the show to do it.
Well, we always look to you for that, so we appreciate that. And, there are a number of different dimensions, of course, we could go into, and I hope we do go into, about the latest events in Afghanistan, where you served, as well as have studied strategically. But I guess before we get into the meat of the subject, some of the people I talked to who are involved in military policy and, criticizing our forever war policy, and some of them doing so from the position of long-term Washington insiders and so on, tell me that one of the things that's striking, one of the many things that's striking about the past week, has been the absolute absence of what for them are the usual media asks, meaning MSNBC, CNN, what have you, that nobody is being asked to go on the mainstream media. Now, maybe you've been asked, I don't know, but nobody that I've talked to is being asked to go on the mainstream media to offer what is not only, a counterpoint to the kind of chorus of people who have been wrong so many times in the past saying we should stay, but even in this case, it's not even a challenging the government. This would be, for them anyway, a position in support of the White House, and yet nobody's asking them on. Have you seen this kind of the same media kind of wall of sound, pro-war wall of sound that these folks seem to be experiencing?
Absolutely, and that wall of sound is actually as toxic as the personal life of Phil Spector, right? The wall of sound. I mean, right. The reality of it is that the big papers, the mainstream papers, for example, and of course their affiliated cable news, they're in the tank for the stay the course option, residual force. It's kind of a mistake. The coverage is we should have stayed for women's rights. We should have stayed for, avoiding a civil war. That, of course, was already going on. The Washington Post, interestingly, which breaks the Afghanistan papers, which are the Pentagon papers of our generation, just didn't get that much attention. That's one thing they do. And then on the other hand, the juxtaposition is that their editorial page since March has had an 11-to-1 ratio of op-eds from either their own columnists or guest columnists that are critical of Biden leaving. Well, 11-to-1 versus the ones who say, no, we really need to go. It's time to go. I think that suppression of dissent in current, and we've talked about this in current media, does not require jailing folks. We'll do that, right? Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, but only in the extreme cases at the margins. The discipline of squelching dissent is silence. It's not anger and putting you in prison so much as it's just apathy. Like, we just ignore you. Who they invite on is a discipline in of itself. One of the reasons that I think you don't see a lot of MSNBC skepticism and criticism is because they like high-ranking people, high-ranking national security officials, high-ranking former retired generals. And there are no Smedley Butlers really in this generation.
Right.
Most of these people work for the war industry directly or indirectly. I mean, they are shills for the war industry. I mean, that's what they are. They are paid PR agents. And they tend to be the same people that were in like the Afghanistan study group who were writing the report telling Biden he should have stayed. And now they're all saying, I told you so. And so somebody that critiques that position is just not as likely to get an invite. We try, and we've had some success, but it is very difficult to break in to that level of national media.
Yeah, and it's also as fair.org, which is freedom, I think, fairness and accuracy in reporting or something, as they point out, there have been reporters on the ground in the Middle East who have been censured or fired for expressing anti not anti-war in the sense of the global sense, but criticism of the ventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet, and the justification given is we want our reporters to be neutral, but then they list example after example of journalists weighing in heavily on we should have stayed, this was the wrong thing to do, we should have upped our presence. So apparently, one form of opinion expression on social media leads to firing. Another leads to not only continued employment, but obviously those of us in the journalism business know that's how you work your sources in the Defense Department and in most administrations and so on. So it seems to me that we have a consent manufacturing machine hard at work here in front of our naked eyes, so to speak, don't we?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, maybe partly apocryphal or taken out of context or where they quote it, but I mean, Upton Sinclair, right, the muckraking journalist, he said, it is very difficult, I'm paraphrasing, to convince a man of one thing if his livelihood or his job depends on him thinking the other. I mean, even if it's true. So the advancement in journalism is not to do what Chris Hedges did, despite his Pulitzers, right, despite his accolades, and give a speech that's critical of an illegal Iraq war. He's been completely vindicated, but he didn't get his job back at the New York Times after they fired him. So this is part of the issue here. And what they'll say is that the problem is these journalists were being biased. They said they don't admit that it's a certain opinion they don't like. They say, hey, journalism is supposed to be objective. But of course, that's a canard, because journalism has never been completely unbiased. Human beings are incapable of being unbiased. And journalism today it's a soap opera. So they do just not like their opinion. It is very, very slanted towards like the pro stay the course, stay in Afghanistan position. I'll say one thing about this that really worries me. I'm almost scared to say it because like it's going to come true or something, or someone's going to get the idea. Someone asked me, Sam Sater actually asked me on his show just yesterday or 2 days ago, do you think this is going to be good or bad for the anti-war movement, what Biden's done here? And I said, my fear is it's actually going to be bad. Because the pro-war, like the hawks, who have been losing a little bit of their position to a certain extent, the public opinion's against them, there's some changes that have been happening, they're going to point to this and say, look what happens if you leave. Look at this mess. Now, of course, the mess was always coming. It was just when. Now, or in 18 months, or in 18 years, or in 18 centuries. But the thing is, I think they're going to point to this. And those scenes of the people on like hanging onto the planes, and it is horrible, and Afghans are suffering. So they'll take that out of context. They'll show you that video clip. They'll say, this is what happens if America is not engaged in the world forever and ever, everywhere and anywhere. They'll say that without the follow-on, which is backstory and context, or an alternative. What could we have done different, and what effect could we meaningfully have had we stayed long term? That's not going to get covered. But hey, nuance, context, contrast, and backstory, that's not really the game at Fox or CNN, usually.
No, you're right. And, I have my only counter to your statement, and I doubt it's cold comfort, to put it that way, is that they were always going to come out on, there's a part of me that says heads I win, tails you lose is their strategy anyway. There's always a counterfactual that they can, after 20 years, we were just on the verge of getting this right. I've actually heard people say that, or if you gave us 5 more years, we would have gotten it right. And, so there's never going to be, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? So we were always going to be up against that. However, the optimistic side of this for me is that the American people continue, according to the latest polling I've seen, to support pulling out. They know it was the right thing to do. The only question I think in people's minds, and this could hurt Biden specifically, is whether the pullout was managed in the best way possible. And I wanted to ask you about this before we go back into the history of Afghanistan, but I wanted to ask you about this, Danny Sjursen, because, here's I was thinking about this because I was thinking, okay, everybody, including, initially me too, it's like, Jesus, you people didn't plan for this. This is hell, people are dying, falling off airplanes, and horrible things are happening. Why didn't you plan for an orderly transition? And there are multiple answers, right? Including, once again, lousy intelligence from the people that so many people are looking to as the wise ones of our society, had no clue what was going to happen this quickly. Secretary of State Blinken saying, well, it's not like it's going to start on a Friday and be all done on, by Monday. Well, yes, actually, it's precisely what happened. So, but then it occurred to me that in terms of this cynical sort of war selling machine we're talking about, okay, you want to talk counterfactuals? Let's say Biden comes into office January 20th and says, I really mean it. We're pulling out this summer, so I'm going to start right now withdrawing American personnel and, Afghans who have worked with us, so that there's a 6 months for an orderly withdrawal. They would, my feeling, but I'd love your thoughts, might have been tactically better, but they would have torn into him for that. In my view, he would have received exactly the same level of criticism. You're giving up the fight before it's even over. Now you're guaranteeing that the Taliban will take power. And at the end, when the Taliban did take power, see, it's because you started it in January. I think there was no winning for Biden in this. But what do you think?
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, politics domestically is driving decisions as ever, this isn't new, more than tactical and operational expediency. I mean, some of that's just the mess of a democracy, good, bad, and ugly, right? And I mean, I prefer democracy, of course, but part of it's also the tribal and hyper-partisan nature of the United States political culture today, especially in the Trump and post-Trump era. You're right. If he starts this process sort of earlier and doesn't wait and it's not calculated politically, things may go a little bit better on the ground at the margins. And of course, I'd like to have seen that done.
Right.
I do think the forecasting was a little bit optimistic, but then again, I didn't call this. I said I think there's about an 80% chance that Kabul holds for a while, and I think there's like a 20% chance that what happened, which is the momentum of the Taliban offensive happens. Look, I mean, war is messy, and let's be clear. In the defense of the Biden people and the national security officials who were wrong, this thing, the Taliban tidal wave turned on morale and psychological factors, more than on bombs, bullets, right, and flanking movements. I mean, a lot of this was very minimal shooting, surrenders, mass defections, deals made. Afghan security forces aren't cowards. I've fought with them. I knew some real bad dudes, and I mean like tough guys who were brave as heck. I'd take them with any one of my soldiers. Afghans are natural, they're not, I don't want to say they're natural warriors, but they are historically hard fighters, and they've been at war a long time. So they're not cowards, but neither are they stupid or suicidal. They just, they're not going to just die when they see which way the wind is blowing. So a little bit of defense of that, but the domestic politics inform this whole thing. That said, I mean, Joe Biden, the ultimate politician, right, in the Senate since 72, he's been wrong about most things in foreign policy. I mean, I've been a big critic, but this wasn't handled perfectly. I'm not saying that it was, and we should discuss those things, but that's not the big story. The big story is we had to go, and the big story is how did we get here, and what kind of collective delusion did it. To Biden's credit, he surprised me when he said he was going to follow through. I really thought he was going to do a classic Biden hedge and keep, half as many soldiers. He was going to King Solomon or Goldilocks the thing.
Right.
He didn't. And even after this, in that speech, which I didn't love everything about that press conference the other day, 2 days ago, but he stuck to his guns. And some of the things he said were true. And I like this. I'm not going to hand this to the next president.
Right. I liked that too.
The option, hot potato.
Yeah, no, I liked that too. But it's interesting. I appreciate your generosity towards these guys. I read an interview. I don't even know what branch he was in, but retired general named, I believe, Douglas Lute. And,
sure.
And he was saying that one of the reasons why this was so badly planned out by the military is that, and I think I'm getting him almost right verbatim, is that the Pentagon is not used to things not going their way. And so they didn't, so his feeling was, well, they didn't invest a lot of energy into planning, because he was saying, look, we've known for 2 years that if Biden gets in, he's going to want to do this. So why weren't we planning for this for 2 years? Well, he said one of the reasons is they're used to getting their way. So they didn't plan for the contingency that has them not getting their way. Do you think that's a fair observation?
that is such an important one. I haven't, no one's asked me that until now, and I hadn't really thought it all the way through, but I think you're dead on. The Pentagon should not have been surprised by this timeline, because at the end of the Trump administration, even kind of midway through, the writing was on the wall that someone might pull the plug on this. I mean, in fact, Trump said it, sort of. The
Right.
Pentagon could have started all their planning and had their ducks in a row. One of the reasons it didn't is exactly what you said. They are used to always winning the argument, because diplomats in even the fanciest of suits, actually they often aren't because they don't make that much money, right, cannot measure up. They feel insecure, and they shouldn't, in front of the guys with all the scrambled eggs medals on their chests, right, and the broad shoulders, despite being 50 years old. This is, the military has always won these arguments. They've bamboozled and bullied Obama into that surge, leaking into the media. They were able to do it to Trump, even though Trump's the best deal maker ever. And they've really figured on being able to do that to Biden. Now, if I've won every argument, as you said, I might just be like, let's not invest time and energy into planning for that. We'll get a delay. I mean, that's how my kids operate. That's how I do. If I know that I have an out and I've always done it, if my toddler knows, if he says that he wants a snack 3 times, I'm probably going to give in. He's not going to worry about not getting the snack. So I think that did happen. And that's on the Pentagon. And that's because they've stepped so far out of the civil-military relationship, a healthy one, into the dominant position, and they've been enabled into that they are no longer acting properly, preparing properly. Last funny, interesting thing, Doug Lute, who was one of the Afghan war czars and served there a long time. Do you know who his star student was at West Point that he wrote glowingly about? Mike Pompeo. Pompeo.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, he taught political science when he was a major, and Mike Pompeo was a cadet in the mid-'80s. And they were all watching Top Gun together.
That's really interesting. People forget that. I think people who have never served or people who haven't studied military issues forget that, the leadership of the military, like any other group of people, it's people, right? I mean, it's personalities, so I think that's really interesting. And again, I mean, we've talked about H.R. McMaster before, but his commentary on this has once again been a huge disappointment to me, because I was at the time an admirer of his book, Dereliction of Duty, which I thought took a very candid look at the failure of military leadership to inform the government, Congress, and the public about how the Vietnam War was going. And yet, it seems to me he has not followed his own prescription for proper military conduct in this case, including in the last week. Have you seen any of his commentary?
He's been off the rails for a while, and same. I mean, he's a legend in the history department at West Point. They still have his desk. Someone's lucky enough to always have the HR master desk in their office, and overall, his book was a pretty solid effort, especially for a fairly young guy getting his PhD as a major before he taught there. He was pretty critical, obviously, of the generals, right, of the Joint Chiefs, and correctly so, rightly so. To show you how much generals don't like each other getting out of line, and dissent is not tolerated. Word was that he would never make general because of that book, and he actually did. It did take a few looks, and Petraeus had to fly back from Iraq personally to weigh in and make the other generals, so the generals picked their own, problematic in itself, to get McMaster up there. And it's not that the book was criticizing anybody currently. The reason they didn't like it, and they didn't even know anything about the Vietnam War, half of them couldn't probably identify who Harold Johnson was or any of these guys. One of the reasons that they did it is it showed that McMaster had a proclivity to criticize, that he had an independent mind and he'd make it out of line someday. We don't want that up here in our club on Mount Olympus, where the generals are. But since then, I don't know what happened with McMaster. Even before he was National Security Advisor, he came and spoke at West Point, and he gave this alarmist talk about all the threats in the world, and we have to be vigilant. He was calling for forever war, generationally. And his book is really wild. But I think that this habit of war is like any other habit. The generals in charge right now have spent their entire careers. War is the norm, peace is the strange. And look, we do what we know, right? We order the same thing at the same restaurant. You get into habits and you don't even realize it. And I think that they can't see a world where we're not doing what we're doing in Afghanistan. And the idea of pulling out almost hurts their stomachs and their egos and everything else. And I think it's really dangerous. And I wish we would get voices besides Petraeus and H.R. McMaster on CNN. But find me a general who would be critical, and I'll tell you, I could probably count them on one hand, and I probably know all their names. And that's it.
To a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But But also, I just wish, and I know this is like idealist thinking, blue sky thinking, I get actually that it hurts to lose. I just wish it hurt nearly as much to lose men and women under your command as it does in a futile cause, as it does to hurt your ego to have to pull out because you couldn't nail it after 20 years. I mean, I'm sorry, but there's a part of me that's like, you know what? You guys effed up. You didn't make it happen. You should step back, sit down, shut up, and reflecting on where your failures were most prominent, whether it was in the planning, in the execution, or in both. I mean, I guess you know more than I do about way more about military strategy, but it seems to me it was both planning and execution, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Well, these guys aren't held accountable. I mean, Colonel Paul Yangling, who didn't make general, right, unsurprisingly, wrote famously in Armed Forces Journal, the official publication, right, in the military, in 2007 or 2006, about the Iraq War. He's saying that he called the article a failure of generalship. And he says, and this is so dead on, but he didn't make general because of it. As it stands today, he concluded, a private who loses his rifle stands to lose more and be punished more than a general who loses a war. And I will tell you this, like, make no mistake, it's not always this way, but it's a dirty little secret. And you don't see it written about a lot in all the patriotic platitudes. But it happens, and I've seen it, and it's broadly true that many times 20-year-old, 22-year-old Americans for $30,000 to $40,000 a year are killed and maimed so majors can become colonels and colonels can become generals. And that may be true in a lot of other professions, but there's not usually blood behind it. And I think that that's pretty obscene. And so I'm often amazed by the utter lack of humility and self-awareness of some of these folks who are generals who go on TV. And they will tell you in every speech, they'll have like a little deck of cards with faces of some of their soldiers on it. And like some of them believe it. Some of them I think are real believers and good people. But they use their soldiers from the past. They'd be like, all that I say is the men, the boys, who they probably never even really visited and ate a hot meal to, because a lot of these guys are really, really prima donnas. Some of them are great, but a lot of them are. They'll use them for that, but then they will advocate for causes from their 7-figure retirements in the war industry that profits from this. And they will go on TV and say more war, knowing full well that that means that more of the people they supposedly adulate are going to die for a cause that probably is unwinnable and unnecessary. You know what I call that? That is the lowest form of human behavior.
Yeah, well, it really is. But Raytheon, I guess, pays a little more for a board seat than, I don't know, the Fellowship of Reconciliation pays for you to, talk about beating sword plowshares or something, I also get a little concerned sometimes, Danny Sjursen, about the way people who are more or less on our side of this issue talk about the Afghan people, because there are, and I have a couple thoughts about that, but basically one of them is, first of all, it's like, well, if they didn't want to fight for their freedom, then we can't force them. Well, if two human beings don't want to kill each other, good. It's like that's better than two human beings killing each other. Now, if it means a society stays in a enslaved condition or whatever, well, the human impulse is toward freedom. Eventually, that should resolve itself. But the idea that we're criticizing people for not killing each other is so twisted and weird that I can't get my head entirely around it, number one. Number two, I think there's this narrative that says that, well, there are backward, vicious people who like to stone women to death, and you're not going to bring them into the 21st century, no matter how many roads you build. And it's like, no, wait a minute. I have friends who were in Afghanistan in the 1970s when it was a sort of peaceful, sophistic form of Islam where hippies went there to buy, whatever, hashish or whatever, and where, the women in Kabul wore whatever they wanted and went to whatever university or school they wanted. They didn't choose this for themselves. Sure, I'm sure the rural people live a very rural life compared to what we're used to, and maybe they have values as rural people here and elsewhere, that the urban populations aren't comfortable with it perhaps should change. But, we are sitting in judgment of people that I think we've done enormous violence to, and I think they should be sitting in judgment of us.
Absolutely. Largely, not completely, but largely, and there's evidence for this that you just mentioned, external factors acted upon the Afghan people to not deny them the agency here when I say that, but to worsen and catalyze more violence. This is how it tends to work. I can't stand when people say the things that you did there, calling the Afghans they're either cowards for not fighting as hard as we wanted them to, which is already a problematic framing. It's their country, they should decide if it's worth dying for, right? That's the first problem. And also, by the way, the petulant side of me says that they should fly the chicken hawks who say that into one of those battle positions at the front line in Kunduz and drop them in a foxhole. And let's watch on reality TV and see if they run, surrender, or fight to the death. I'll tell you, you don't know what you're going to do in that situation. I can tell you this because I've done all those things except surrender, but I've run, I've acted not the way I wished I acted. I've cowered at least and not really been as brave as I hoped. You don't know how you're going to act until you're in that situation. But the barbaric thing isn't really fair either, because as you said, history for these people starts whenever it's politically expedient for them. So they act as though history begins the day the Taliban took over in 94 when they're founded, like 96 when they take Kabul, or it started on 9/11, or maybe it started in 1979 when the Soviets invaded. What they forget is what you're mentioning, which is in the 1960s and 70s, it was like Afghanistan was like on the hippie trail. You could see women in like miniskirts in Kabul, and the Islam there was lots of different Islams that were practiced in Afghanistan, but it was known traditionally as like very strong Sufi and syncretic and tolerant brands of Islam. So this isn't ancient. People always use that word ancient, and they often use it. It's actually a pejorative and a little offensive. Like it's like the ancient Sunni Shia, conflict. You can't fix that. It's actually like they've generally lived at peace. Okay, there's been contested times and there's been flare-ups, but for example, in Iraq, they weren't killing each other all the time. They usually weren't killing each other over the last 1,500 years. So it's a lack of historical understanding. It's a lack of cultural awareness and empathy, but that seems to be the underlying tone in Washington. Ever and always, maybe, but especially now.
Yeah, it really does. And so I want as many allies as we can get, but I don't want them to diminish, another people in order to do it. So you're very familiar, Danny Sjursen, with the situation in Afghanistan as it has been, as it is now. We're already seeing little pockets of resistance to the Taliban. We're seeing what seems to be on the part of the Taliban, whose record on a lot of human rights issues is, pretty appalling. But we're seeing, it didn't get a lot of reporting here, but I saw a report that they went to a Shiite, some of the leaders went to a Shiite mosque to celebrate Ashura, which is a big Shia holiday, and which for them is like a big deal, I think, from my understanding of Islam, which I have studied. And they're giving reassurances. Women can stay in their positions, although, they suspended a female newscaster or whatever. So it's a little bit mixed signal, but they're trying to, it seems, act as, quell panic and, put on a kinder, gentler face or whatever. But it seems to me, my understanding is the Taliban in many ways is kind of a loose confederation of different groups around the country. So, even if these overtures are sincere, they may not be universally held. So I guess all this is by way of saying, any thoughts on how this might play out?
It's difficult to predict and how the Taliban will act, if this is genuine or not. But I think that there are some indicators that we should take it seriously, at least, that maybe some of it is genuine. I don't think it's a very controversial thing for me to go on the record and say that I'm decidedly not exactly pro-Taliban, right?
Right.
I find them much of their past behavior to be, pitiless and horrifying and all this. The Taliban, as you mentioned, is not a monolith. It is less of a monolith than it even was in the 90s, and it wasn't a monolith then. It's a complicated thing, because when it became a national resistance organization against the occupiers, which was us, and against what they perceived and to some extent were, to some extent, the lackeys of us in Kabul, they brought on a whole bunch of different people with a whole bunch of different motives. Some of them are true believers in the Islamist side. Some of them are drug dealers, basically, and criminal and racketeers. They're all a lot of these things, by the way, but some of them are mostly motivated by that. And some of them are just nationalists, like Ho Chi Minh, was more of a nationalist than a communist, that kind of thing. So everyone fights for the Taliban for a variety of motives. Here was what I do think is true. This could be insincere, either completely or partially. I think the answer is probably only partially. Most things are gray, right? That's kind of obvious, although people seem to still miss it in Washington. In Washington, everything apparently is black and white. At least they think so. But they could be insincere, but we know this. They are way more of a rational actor, the leadership of the Taliban, rational actors, than we've given them credit for really ever. They know that it is not necessarily in their benefit. For example, they could have been attacking Americans throughout the time when the withdrawal was starting to happen. They could have been working harder to kill a few more Americans on the way out the door. They make strategic decisions that are good for the movement, that are more likely to hold their rank and file together, that are more likely to please some of their external backers to the extent that they're even under any control of them anymore. Look, the Taliban, just because we don't like them, just because our leadership and for the most part, our American political social culture is different from theirs, does not mean that they're irrational. It doesn't mean that the decisions they make in a war and in diplomacy are irrational. I think that they know that it behooves them to offer some sort of amnesty. And they also know it behooves them not to get slammed by more American bombing at the end, or to get Biden to throw a few thousand more in. Yeah, that may bolster their narrative, but they're tired too. They're tired too. Their rank and file, they can only take so much, just like our rank and file. I don't know. I've had to motivate soldiers, and I was scared all the time of one thing, that they might say no. Because the minute they do, my lieutenant bars and my captain bars mean nothing, and they become the arbitrary veneer they always were. They've got to worry about that too. So I think we have to take really seriously the fact that the Taliban is a rational actor, does things strategically, and then we ought to act accordingly, rather than building them up as some sort of straw man, because that just leads to strategic folly.
So that, and then I'll let you go, but that brings me in mind of the fact that Facebook, I guess, as the owner of WhatsApp or one of the other social media companies, banned the Taliban the other day. And, there's a lot of talk, don't negotiate with them. And it seems to me that if, in fact, they are going to be in power, and if, in fact, we are not going to re-invade the country, which I would be strongly opposed to, it seems to me the rational thing. And if we really care about the status of women and the other things we profess such care about, and we should care about, but I often think that people who profess that don't care about, it seems to me we should do a couple things. One, but I want your thoughts. One is we owe them immense. We owe them massive humanitarian aid, number one. And number two, we should enter into talks with them saying we'll do even more for you, but we are expressing our concerns, not because we have a right to dictate, but these are our concerns. Let's talk and see what we can work out. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I mean, I do think we do owe something to the Afghan people, and not just the ones who worked for us. Yes, definitely them, especially if their safety is theoretically or maybe currently at risk. I mean, I have interpreters that are stuck over there personally that I'm in contact with. Yeah. And that's hard. Okay. But it's not about me. It's a wide range of things. So yes, the people who work with us, let's prioritize that to some extent because they could be at risk. But I think we owe some sort of reparations to say the dirty word, right? Some sort, we have responsibilities to the messes we make. And it goes back to like the Great Gatsby. And it really bothers me about how the United States fulfills that. At the end of the book, the narrator is like criticizing the privileged classes in Long Island. He says, they were careless people. They broke things and they hurt people and they made messes and they expect other people to pick them up, and then they retreated back into their privilege, And that's American foreign policy so often. And this is what worries me. I think we're going to see something petty potentially. And the petty thing will be this. It will be, we can't give humanitarian aid to the Afghan people as much as we'd like because we can't funnel it through the Taliban because the Taliban's bad and they'll just steal it and they're an enemy and they're a terrorist organization and all this. And so behind that like principled stand over somewhat arbitrary things when there's people starving or when there's people really in abject poverty, we've done this before, by the way, where we've denied needy people because we don't like their government. And that's like denying like children something they need because you don't like their parents. I mean, it's not that they're Taliban or parents, they're just children, but it's like that same thing. And we do it all the time. And I'm afraid we'll do it again. I really hope we're better than that. But, oh man, history's not on our side there.
No, including the continuing sanctions we have around the world now. So, including in that part of the world. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Danny Sjursen, former U.S. Army Major, director of the Eisenhower Media Network, thanks for all the great work you do. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thank you for having me, and look forward to doing it again.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.